If you want to understand the challenge, I would put it in terms of two phrases. Those who speak of a clash of civilizations and those who talk about a civilizational dialogue. About 5 or 6 years ago, as I was watching the Gulf War unfold, I was very concerned about this notion of clash of civilizations. Huntington had not written his piece yet, but I just had a sense that the way things were shaping up, there was this danger. And I wrote a book called The Islamic Threat, Myth or Reality. But I remember having the concern, as the book was with the publisher, it hadn't come out yet, that maybe I was wrong. Maybe this sense of confrontation was going to pass. You know, the Gulf War would pass and somehow everything would be wonderful. And in fact, that kind of issue or challenge is out there. On the other hand, in the last 5 years, the first major speaker at our center, in addition to the Ayatollah who visited me the first day I opened the center 5 years ago, about a half hour after I opened the center, and caused all kinds of comments throughout the School of Foreign Service, even though it's a School of International Affairs. People just couldn't believe that we had an Ayatollah walking into the building, let alone coming down to my center. And I remember sticking my head out the door and saying, there's a new boy in town. We've got a new approach, you know, in the university. But then we had Anwar Ibrahim come, the Deputy Prime Minister of Malaysia. And he gave a major address, received the Presidential Medal, and it was called Towards a Civilizational Dialogue. And more recently, as you know, President Khatami of Iran has talked about civilizational dialogue. And so we have those two options out there. And those options, therefore, are not only being discussed within the West, but they are being discussed among Muslim leaders in terms of relations between the Muslim world and the West. What can we say about the relationship of Islam and the West, past and present? On the one hand, it's a difficult topic to talk about because both sides have their perception of the other. Both sides have engaged, as indeed Iran and the United States has engaged for the last 20 years, in a process of mutual Satanization, in a process at times of mutual demonization. From the early spread and expansion of Islam, to the Crusades, to the Inquisition, to the Ottoman Empire, to European colonialism, to the Cold War, to the post-Cold War, there have indeed been points of conflict and confrontation. No one can deny that, and I will talk about them tonight. But you will note when I get to the 21st century, the question is whether we're going to choose to move beyond them or to just stay comfortably talking about them. But those points of conflict and confrontation have been there. And the irony is, the conflict and confrontation came not only because of differences, they came because of similarities. The very similarities that I will argue become the basis for moving forward together were, in the old days, reasons for confrontation, or taken that way. The spread of Islam was taken as a theological, political, and civilizational threat by Western Christendom. Why? Theologically, it would sound like we were talking about similarities. Muslims believed in the one true God, as do Christians and Jews. Muslims believed in a long line of prophets. They believed in revelation to Moses, to Jesus, and one final time to the Prophet Muhammad. They believed in accountability and responsibility in life, social justice, family values. And they believed, if you will, in eternal accountability, heaven and hell. And yet this itself became a source for conflict. Again, why? If Christians were comfortable in saying that Christianity had come to succeed Judaism, that the revelation had somehow been distorted and now there would be a new revelation, Christians were not comfortable when Muslims came along and extended that same logic and said, we have one final revelation now coming to the Prophet Muhammad in the Quran. If Christians were comfortable in saying, our community has now been given a universal mission to spread God's will, they were challenged and threatened when Muslims came along and said, and God has now given that mission over to us. So in an interesting kind of way, theological similarities became a source for, in a sense, theological confrontation at times. Politically, obviously, the spread of Islam, the extent to which it overwhelmed Eastern Christianity, was seen as a threat. The extent to which it spread globally, it was seen as a competitive threat. And of course, civilizationally and culturally, this was the case. And yet, there were many points of cooperation. These points of cooperation, and indeed of civilizational dialogue, are too easily passed over. Part of that is that in many ways we are more comfortable. You know, we can criticize the media today for being concerned about headline events and conflict, and you put the media on and they don't talk about what's good. They just put it on and all you see are the murders and the crimes. But in fact, that's what human nature is also attracted to. The media wouldn't be doing it if people didn't look for it. And that's what sells books, and that's what sells TV shows, and that's what grabs people's interest. And so in a strange kind of way, we engage in that ourselves. You know, when we talk about our civilizational and historical past, we see the points of conflict. We often don't talk about the points of cooperation. As Islam spread, Christians and Jews played a major role in the Islamic Empire. That's a major part of history. Some are aware of it, most aren't. As Islam developed its great civilization and culture, it would have never been done without Muslims learning from Western philosophy and science and mathematics, and then building on that, as well as obviously also drawing off in their primary, if you will, disciplines and sciences, Quranic studies, studies of hadith, Sharia, usul al-fiqh, etc. But in terms of that civilizational dialogue, it was very much there. It's very interesting that today is March 7th. If I have it right, and I cannot believe this, my mother would be so happy, today is the feast of St. Thomas Aquinas. St. Thomas Aquinas is one of the great Christian and Catholic theologians and philosophers of all times. Thomas Aquinas was able to be the philosopher and theologian that he was because he not only Thomas Aquinas, but his teacher drew heavily off Arab and Islamic thought and culture. That kind of confluence is often overlooked. Those points of contact and cooperation are often overlooked. And indeed, part of the problem we have is that we often see the world in terms of either or. Rather than saying there are points of conflict, there are points of cooperation, what can we learn from it, how do we move forward?